Welcome to the I-24 News National Security Podcast, in partnership with INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. I'm your host, Nicole Zedeck. Each week, we're bringing you in-depth discussions with expert analysts on some of the most pressing national security challenges facing Israel today. So, let's get started. Right now, Europe is at a critical point in time. Between the war in Ukraine, Donald Trump returning to the White House, key elections that could shift France and Germany's role in the European Union, there is a lot unfolding that could shake up the entire continent. In today's episode, we're looking at how Europe is navigating this global competition, from security dilemmas with Russia and Washington to economic pressures from China and the United States. We'll talk about the recent impact of recent leadership changes, Europe's response to the October 7th attacks and rising anti-Semitism, and how these dynamics are shaping Israel's strategic outlook. The main question being, what role will Europe play in the rapidly shifting world order? Well, to talk about it all, I am joined on the podcast today by Dr. Rémi, a researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies. Rémi, thanks for being with us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
There's a lot that we're going to unpack right now, but let's start. There's so much happening in Europe right now. So when it comes to these shifting global power dynamics and Europe's role in that, break down what we know right now.
I think you were very right to say it was a critical point for Europe, because I think Europe in the last 20 years based its successes on three assumptions. First of all, the assumption that the US would take care of its security, of the European security. Second, that Europe could get cheap energy from Russia. And third, that Europe could have good trade relations with China. And today, in the last 5 years, these three assumptions just crashed. And we are at a time, that's also very important to say, that Europeans are awakening. They see that this model I just described has been a failure, that it doesn't work anymore, and they are now trying to find new solutions in front of huge challenges they have to face.
A lot of challenges there. One of the interesting ones you talk about, and it comes to both the United States and Russia when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And so how does that depict Europe's stance when it comes to, let's say, their own security and defense aspects?
I think that we see a change regarding the way Europe sees its environment. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 did not come in an empty space. We had the first changes in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea that started a few processes in Europe of re-securitization of the view of Europe, of its continent. But still, the war in the Ukraine has been seen by Europeans as a huge change. As German used Zeitwende, change in time, and the way they look. And we must also see that the showdown with Russia is not only in Ukraine. We see a lot, and it's normal, the war in Ukraine, that's the main important thing. But we have to see it as a global showdown. We see in Africa, for example, that Wagner groups are trying to destabilize regimes supported by France with a lot of success. We see destabilization campaigns also in domestic politics of countries close to Russia, Georgia, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria. And we have also the issue, and I mentioned it earlier, of gas, of energy. A lot of European economies, especially the German one, the biggest one, relied on Russian gas for their industry. Now they have to find other things. They are not very successful in finding alternative, so that actually Europe, looking at the East, sees a front line, and we must say, until now, it's not ready to face the huge Russian enemy alone, and that's why it still needs Washington in a time when Washington is less and less ready to do a lot of things for Europe.
And that's one of the different key aspects of this relationship between the United States and Europe, but also Europe stuck in the middle, actually geographically as well, when it comes to the United States and China. Europe walking this fine line of also needed the economic partnership with China, but not wanting to anger the United States.
Exactly, and that we see exactly the same thing. The fact that on the one hand, Europe needs China. It really needs it in a few important fields of rare material or semiconductors. The European European economy needs to have China and China products. The problem is, and it's a problem even that is not linked to the US position, and that is that China entered an economic crisis. I'm sure you mentioned it with other of our experts, and reacted to this economic crisis by what is called overcapacity and overproduction. It means that actually European markets are now fled with Chinese products that are very cheap because the Chinese state give a lot of money to Chinese industrial production, and these products coming from China are actually destroying the European industry. One short example that is very important, I guess, is electric cars. Europe is going through a huge change, what is called sometimes the Green Deal, changing its economy, moving towards a more ecological economy, but the European car industry was not ready to this big change, and the Chinese car industry was ready, which means that actually European citizens are paying policies of Green Deal that are serving not the European industry, but the Chinese one. And we see a change in this position because now the European Commission has decided on sanctions against Chinese electric cars, what I said, awakening of Europe, but still, Europe is not ready to go as far as the US would want them to, because the US has a much more aggressive position, but it's linked to two things. First, the US is a stronger economy. It has a lot of things that Europe doesn't. For example, it has been stronger in communication, it's stronger in some fields where Europe still lay behind. And also it has its own energy. Once again, we're linked to this question. And also, the second thing I want to mention is that the Inflation Reduction Act we saw from the Biden administration has been also very, very negatively seen by Europeans, because actually the coming back of protectionism in the US means that it's hurting the Chinese economy, but it's also hurting the European economy. So Europe is actually in between a Chinese economy that is overproducing, a US economy that is coming back to protectionist measures, and it doesn't know what to do because it doesn't have the strength of either of these economies, and also it doesn't have the political will to go to protectionism, because this would go against all of the political tradition of Europe in the last 50 years.
Well, let's talk about that political tradition and possibly the shifts that we can be seeing. Let's start even with the European Parliament elections that we saw over the summer. When we're talking about any shifts, we are seeing a little bit of continuity as well. Ursula von der Leyen, she's the second term now as president of the EU Commission. And so what does this mean about, even though there are some shifts, possibly the continuity of policy as well?
Yeah, you have a certain continuity, which is actually the domination of center-right parties in the European political world. But regarding this election of Ursula von der Leyen, first, we must say that the majority she got in the European Parliament is the thinnest one we saw in the last decade. So it already tells you that there is a problem of leadership in Europe, the fact that finding a coalition and a majority in the European Parliament is more difficult than it was before. Why? First of all, because and now I'm moving from continuity to changes, Ursula von der Leyen in the past relied on a center coalition, which was center-right, center-left, Social Democrats, Greens, a little Greens, and Liberals. This coalition is in problems. Why? Because one of the parts of this coalition, center-right, got stronger after the European elections, but this center-right is not sure that it wants to continue this coalition with other movements of the center. Why? Because the political movements that got stronger after these elections are far-right, what is called far-right movements. So it means that you see, even in the ecological policies of Ursula von der Leyen or on other issues, we have this strong center-right group in the European Parliament, but it's always hesitating between going to the center as it had done earlier, or going to the far-right parties and thus creating frictions with former allies. So we have this continuity, you're right, Ursula von der Leyen, weaker than before, but also in the policies we will see changes because the coalition may be less strong coalition, but according to subjects, we will see the center-right moving either to the far-right or to the center.
Well, and this is not only with the European Union as a whole. We have upcoming elections in France, and this seems to be really similar to what France is battling right now as more and more of the constituents move towards this far-right party.
We see two things in France after the elections of July that is but also a long-term change and trend, is the fact that the period of big parties that are few but strong in political systems and in parliaments, it's over in France. France had a political system that enabled governments without even thinking about coalitions. Now we are in a situation in which, in France, we have the fourth government in 1 year. In 2024,
wow.
France had 4 governments, which is completely contrary to any of French political tradition, and which is also not what Europe expected from France in this crisis. We have another country that is in crisis, and it's Germany, and with the same problem. It was the first time in Germany that there was a coalition based on 3 parties, because 2 parties were not enough to build a coalition in the Bundestag, in the German parliament. So Germany is also dealing with the rise of new actors, especially extreme left and extreme right, and the fact that the big parties are not big enough. And this time, it's a critical time. We mentioned the crisis. We mentioned the fact that the leadership in the European Union is weak. We also should mention that the fact that both France and Germany,
which are mainly the 2 powerhouses when it comes to the European
exactly,
Union.
That's like the French-German couple is generally the leadership of Europe. You have generally a very strong Berlin-Paris relationship that can even convince other countries, that can really lead more courageous, more audacious policies. And this couple is very weak because the German chancellor has no legitimacy anymore and is just entering a campaign, waiting for the elections coming in February. And the French President Macron is trying to build a government and is not able to do so, waiting maybe for other elections in the next summer. And the question is, who can be the leader of Europe? Which country? And we are still waiting. A few people said Italy could play this role in a very strange way. Now Italy is the stable country. It was not the case in earlier years. But now Italy has a strong government with a strong legitimacy. We should also say that Meloni is coming from a movement that has a lot of similarity with Trump, so that it's not very afraid of the coming of Trump to power, contrarily to other European governments. Meloni has a very good personal relation to Elon Musk, which is important in this day. But so far, Italy has not tried to use the political vacuum to get forward. And what Meloni has tried to do, the Italian Prime Minister has tried to do, has been rather a failure than a success. Other people think about Poland, for example. Poland is a very important country. It's linked to what we mentioned about Russia. The eastern flank of Europe has become a very important region of the continent. Poland is a good NATO ally, spending a lot to build its military power, much more than other countries that claim to be European powers and do not do enough for their own defense. These are, I think, the 2 big candidates to the 2 big countries we have to follow in this political crisis in Europe. But so far, the situation is still very negative, and we have a lot of weak European leaders looking at one another and waiting for the other side to take the lead.
Waiting for someone to step up. And in the midst of all of this political turmoil, it seems, we're also seeing the outcomes and the ramifications of the increase in anti-Semitism throughout Europe right now, all coupled with the October 7th attacks right here in Israel. And so as a whole, how has the European Union really responded to October 7th? Because in the beginning, we did hear many of these European leaders at least supporting Israel's right to defend itself. But over the past year, we have seen that messaging start to change.
Yeah, there have been some changes. First of all, you have to understand that at the level of the European Union, foreign policy is something that must be decided unanimously. And
27 states.
27 states
agree on.
A lot, and also very, very different positions on this conflict, on October 7th, on the situation in Gaza. If you compare, for example, a group of very anti-Israeli countries that are Spain, Ireland, Belgium, and countries that are very pro-Israeli, Hungary, Austria, Germany in a certain way, you cannot find a common line other than very, very vague words. What we see, on the other hand, is that the European Parliament, that has only the power to make statements, is rather pro-Israeli. And it's linked to the fact that center-right and right parties that are in Europe more pro-Israelis than the left are in a majority there. So that's what we see. If we look at countries, we see exactly what you just said, that I think the polarization, I think October 7th actually has made a lot of problems in Europe more acute and stronger, and things that people knew were happening in Europe just appeared in a very blunt way. We have the rise of anti-Semitism that is also a new anti-Semitism that we see coming from certain group, from the left, from also migrants community or second or third generation of migrant community with a strong Muslim dimension in that. Things that we knew in the last decade or two that were happening below the radar, but now appeared very, very clearly in the demonstrations we see on the streets, in some statements by politicians, especially from the left. But we have also to understand that part of the European reaction within states were also to use October 7th as a way to make statements, because these issues of anti-Semitism, of immigration, have been key issues of the European political debate for at least 30, 40 years. Seeing this issue becoming more acute after October 7th made a lot of local and national politicians want to actually ride on the wave, and either in their anti-Israeli or their pro-Israeli position have a more exaggerated maybe position, because they saw there was a very, very sensitive issue in public opinion, and they tried to make political gains on it with more or less success, because at the end of the day, a lot, and that we saw in a lot of elections, a lot of voters are more interested in the economics and their personal situation than knowing what is going on in the Middle East.
Well, one of the interesting aspects when it comes to the European Union and Europe in general is all of the migrants. Right now, a great example of that is Syria, and how the European countries are handling how they let in all of these migrants from Syria following the civil war. But now with the ousting of Assad, how are they handling this? Because we're seeing, especially in the past several days, there was this deadly Christmas car ramming attack in Germany. Now, the motives are still unclear, but this sparked nationwide protests as well, calling for this mass deportation of some of those migrants. And so we are seeing the ramifications of what is happening here in the Middle East taking control in Europe, because there's so many descendants of Middle Eastern countries.
Yeah, I think the situation also differs from a country to another. First of all, maybe we have to remind that one of the reasons for this immigration is also because Europe, from a demographic point of view, is not in a very good situation. For example, you mentioned Germany. If no migrants had come to Germany in time, Germany would have a decrease in its population since in the 1970s. The situation is so bad. And so the European economy also needs people, younger people, people ready to be in lower qualification jobs. So that was the main argument for that, and there is some justification in it. We have also a different situation because, for example, if you look at France, the problem is France is not people arriving, it's not people coming, it's the sons and grandsons of people that arrived in the 70s or the 80s and still very strongly attached to their former identity. And we see, for example, that in the wave of terror attacks that France suffered in the 2010s, a lot of the people involved were with the French or European citizenship. Germany, on the other hand, has really welcomed waves of refugees. It was especially 2013, 2015, you had all this refugee welcome policy of Germany. People said that as many as 1 million Syrians arrived to Germany in this time. And that is a different problem because they are less integrated in the population. Generally, they don't have European citizenship. So that now that also in Germany, immigration has become an issue, also because of terror attacks that we saw. You mentioned the last one, but there were a few attacks that, for example, Germany decided to close partially its borders with other European countries. That is a very drastic step that a rather left-oriented government took this year. So the debate in Germany is changing, but I agree with you that one of the interesting things is that when the situation in Syria changed, I work on Turkey, so also the issue of Syrian refugees in Turkey is a very, very sensitive one. And so I was not surprised to hear the Turks very early say, oh, we have now the possibility to send the refugees back there. But actually the European reaction on a similar tone did not come very late after that. Really, in the days after the end of Assad's regime, Europeans started saying, we will not welcome refugees anymore, we will not give visas to refugees anymore coming from Syria, so that you're right. Actually, migration, either directly, either through the acts of some people going to terrorism, even though, for example, in Germany, the terrorist that struck the Christmas market was from Saudi origin, some European citizens don't make this difference. So the pressure coming from the population through the rise of far-right parties make this issue of immigration, of refugees, of changes in the European identity key in the European political debate in all of the country of West Europe, at least in the last 10 years.
We talked about also how you mentioned many of the European Union leaders, and the European Union itself has come out with more of this supportive stance when it comes to Israel. Yet the EU is also falls under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And right now, many of the European countries are grappling with how to actually go through with the ICC's arrest warrants on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who now there's the reports that he likely will not be able to attend the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in Poland. And so we are seeing a different stance in many of these European countries when it comes to the ICC.
I think that a lot of leaders are very uneasy with the situation right now, because Europe always, and especially the European Union and most European leaders, are very proud to be the region, the continent of the norms, the continent of the liberal order, the continent of international law, especially compared, for example, of course, compared to China and Russia, but also compared to the US that is sometimes perceived in Europe as being a very realpolitik country, and Europe is supposed to go according to law. So there is a very strong symbolic value and power of the ICC and all the process that are going there, also because the international jurisdictions played a huge role also after the wars in the ex-Yugoslavian space, which was very close to European hearts. So what we saw actually after this decision of the ICC, a lot of European leaders talked, but first of all, they did not agree. Even, for example, if I take the Italian government, it's a coalition government, part of the ministers said that they will obey the ICC, thus arrest Netanyahu if he comes to Italy. Other ministers say they would not and they should not, so that even within one political system you have opposite views. But I think one of the things we must say is that actually politicians are also not very clear because they are not sure that they are the one taking the decision. At the end of the day, because it's a jurisdiction, it's linked to the judiciary. At the end of the day, it's more judges than politicians that will take the decisions. And if we see a case in which Netanyahu tries to go within a European country, we will see a lot of different voices and a lot of voices that are trying to find a middle way, but we are not sure that they will find it.
Murky waters that we're going through when it comes to most of these dilemmas facing Europe right now. Dr. Rémi Daniel, we're going to go through a quick rapid fire round before we wrap up in the last few moments here. I'm going to ask a few quick questions and just give me the first thought and response that comes to your mind. Our first question being, are France and Germany losing their grip on EU leadership?
I think is this a huge vacuum? I think Germany is actually in a huge crisis, especially economically, and we are seeing the whole continent paying for the failures of German leaders, especially I would say Angela Merkel, that was a huge star in her time, and as is now seen as the one creating a very, very bad situation for Germany, but also for the whole of Europe.
Now, can Europe maintain economic ties with China while still maintaining this alliance with the United States?
It tries. A lot of Europeans are convinced they have no choice. They have no choice. They critically need Chinese products or even Chinese markets. They know that the current situation hurts them, and they hope they will convince the US that it's okay to continue trading with China, but it's a huge dilemma and the answers are not clear.
Okay, so we'll keep that one 50-50. Now, as a whole, is the European Union losing or gaining influence on a global scale?
I think it's losing. It's losing because I mentioned Africa. I think Africa is a great example. You see new powers coming, you see China, you see Russia, you see Turkey just entering a space that was seen as European. And you see in other places, even you mentioned the Indo-Pacific, countries say, we don't need you, Europeans. We need you to be able to deal with your problems, start being strong against Russia, start being strong against your enemies, and maybe you will become relevant, but we are not there.
So we will certainly have to see what happens with this possible power vacuum left in the region. Dr. Rémi Daniel, thank you for joining us and unpacking all of the developments and what's to unfold here in Europe in the coming years, it seems.
Thank you.
Now, that is all we have on this latest edition of the National Security Podcast. Make sure to follow us on Spotify for all of the latest episodes as we continue to talk about the most pressing national security dilemmas facing Israel today. For now, I'm Nicole Zedeck. Thanks for listening.